if you've got really close friends, if you've got really fantastic peer groups that you respect, that are high quality, and you've got the instinct to ask for feedback at those moments, that's a great playbook. If you've got brilliant peer group, you've got great feedback, guess what? You'll have the confidence then to deal with most situations.
Welcome to the Mindflick podcast. The Mindflick podcast explores the psychology of high performance. Every episode, we will sit down with leaders, athletes, and change makers to uncover the turning points, the pressure moments, and the crucial experiences that define their journey.
Today's conversation is with Manoj Badale, entrepreneur, investor, and co-owner of the Rajasthan Royals. What makes this episode different is that Manoj doesn't frame his life through obvious career or CV moments. Instead, he talks about turning points that only made sense decades later. And I think there's a really powerful thread running through it. In the conversation, we also explore the tension between things like instinct and data, structure and ego, and what it really takes to sustain performance in business and in elite sport. So if you're interested in mindset, resilience, and the environments that shape high performance over time, I think you'll find this a fascinating listen.
Well, Manoj, it's a great pleasure to have you on the Mindflick podcast. The genesis story that I tell about Mindflick all the time is really our experiences in elite sport and how individuals and teams really act under pressure situations. And what we try to do at Mindflick is to distill our experiences and then make it as accessible as possible to people in other contexts, particularly the business world. Your background is very much the other way around, which is really a huge experience in building, scaling businesses. And then you've taken that over the last 18 years and sort of tried to distill that and put it into the elite sporting world with Rajasthan Royals. So really interested to get into that as this podcast goes on. But as you know, we start this podcast always talking about these turning points in our lives, the moments that have allowed us to see the world differently, change our perspectives on life, etc., etc. So why don't we just plow on with your first turning point? Talk us through that.
Actually, just before I talk about the first turning point, because you did send me the email ahead of the podcast saying that you were going to ask about turning points. And actually, the first thing that sort of dawned on me as I thought about the answer to that question was there are some turning points that you are aware of at the time because they're sort of so obvious and they're so significant. And there are some that you actually don't realize until years later. For example, in my case, when you ask the question about my first turning point, the obvious answer is obviously coming to the UK as a baby. My father, who was doing a master's at Imperial, got a job here pretty much as I was born, and then just called up my mum and said, actually, we're going to go to this place. She didn't speak a word of English. She was probably 18 years old at the time, 19 maybe. And, just got told that she was to come to the UK and to bring one of her two children. And me being the youngest and perhaps a little bit being influenced by me being the boy, came with my mum. So that's the sort of obvious turning point. But the one that I didn't really discover and realize was equally significant until I had therapy on it, probably 40 years later, was the time when my parents had decided to bring my sister because they had enough money to be able to do that, which was about 5 years later. And my sister joined us and we sort of lived together as a four. She was 2 years older than me, much more Indian, if you like, than me. And she hated it. She hated being in England. England was a tough place for sort of Indian immigrants, Asian immigrants. It's not a particularly easy place for immigrants right now. But it's a particularly tough place, I think, then. And there was a moment when my parents decided, because my sister was so unhappy, that she would go back and live with her grandparents, and we were separated, and the trauma of that was something that I hadn't realized was a trauma until actually close to 40 years later. So I think that obviously the cultural switch, although as a baby I really grew up in England and was English, being in an Indian family with a sister that wasn't here, but then was here and then wasn't here. That was quite sort of an interesting time, really, and probably a turning point in the sense that it was probably around that age, 5 or 6 or 7, that I became very, very aware of the fact that I felt English, lived in England, but wasn't fully English. I had these Indian parents who committed to bringing me up in an English way, but fundamentally were Indian. I had this sister who was fully Indian, and that sort of mixed cultural upbringing, I think, was a very important turning point.
It's really, I mean, resonates with me, given that I was born in South Africa and came here as a young person as well, and absolutely feel English. But there's just a slight bit about how people see you, or perhaps how you think people see you, which sort of plays into kind of how you view the world and maybe your motivations as well. And I wondered, like, when you look back at that time, how has that shaped your motivations, both like as a personally and professionally? Like, do you think that's had a big impact on kind of your drive to succeed, or?
I don't know about my drive to succeed, but it's had a really clear impact on me, which is I'm desperate to fit in. So whatever situation I'm in, whatever country, company, social setting, I have this desperate desire to fit in. And I always slightly feel like the outsider, even though 50 years on from being made to feel like an outsider on a daily basis at school, on the walk home from school, in your own home, clearly that isn't true, but I've still got that deep insecurity of wanting to fit in.
And did you feel like that, you know, without going into too much detail, was actually, you said you went through some therapy, like, was that incredibly illuminating, or was it kind of telling you what deep down you kind of knew about yourself anyway?
No, I think there's a lot written about therapy, and you guys know far more about psychology and therapy than I do. But I think I say to the kids, I think it's well, they're not kids anymore, but you know, I say to them, you've got to invest in it. I think the tough thing about therapy is finding the right therapist, and there's no kind of playbook for doing that. But I think it's a really, really important thing when you've had a complicated upbringing or a complicated life, as 95% of people do. I think to really understand yourself, you having someone that's objectively assessing and discussing every part of what makes you the way you are is really important.
Manoj, you mentioned at the start there's different kinds of turning points. There's some that you're aware of at the moment. There's some you only look back and realize that was a key kind of moment.
Yeah.
Those examples you've given there of kind of, moving across the world, your sister, kind of, there are moments in a young person's life where you've got very little control.
Totally.
You just respond.
Totally.
And I'm wondering, obviously there's things that come from that you need to work through, but there's also strengths that can come from that, such as that you mentioned there, that ability, that desire to adapt to a context you're in. I'm just wondering, how is that kind of, that willingness to adapt, that desire, it could be to fit in, it could be to deal with a volatile, business landscape. Like, how has that served you in another way?
I think the big positive of having that character trait, if you like, of adaptability is the pace of change is getting faster and faster. And I spent 30 years with Charles building tech businesses, and it doesn't get any more ambiguous and uncertain and fast moving than that. And I think it's our collective ability to adapt that's allowed us to carry on doing what we're doing and stay sane. So I think adaptability is just a hugely important trait, and a willingness to change, and not necessarily the same thing. I'm in an age now where, I look at some of my friends, and I look at this tsunami of change that we're about to hit with AI, and I see some of them sort of immediately taking a negative stance towards it and finding all the reasons why it isn't going to affect them, and I see others incredibly curious and wanting to embrace it. And I think you have to embrace change. Otherwise, ultimately, you'll be disappointed with your own progress.
Yeah. In sport, we often talk about challenge or threat states that people fall into. And the same situation, two people are going to see that very differently. It's the mindset that we take, how we view that situation, that determines if it's one or the other.
I think that's right. And, I've been blessed in recent years, as Straussy alluded to watching close up some of the greatest sportsmen that have ever played, in this case, the game of cricket. And when you're outside of a sport, or when you're in the boardroom talking about sport, you do always wonder what is it that separates the really good players, or the really good players that you thought were going to be great, and the ones that are great. And actually, I don't know if it's right or not, and Strauss would have a much better perspective, but I do see the greats always, always, always being attracted to the biggest possible challenges. And the bigger the challenge, the better they seem to perform, and the more excited they seem to be. Where I've seen some really, really, really good players just freeze at those big moments. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Straussy.
I would agree with that. And I think one of the studies that I looked at when I was running elite cricket with the ECB was this thing around predicting young players and how well they will transfer into the professional game and how far they will go. And one of the very strong correlations actually was around problem solving. Like,
Right.
put you in a new situation, how quickly do you learn a way to deal with that new situation? So it's not about how good you are. It really comes back to this idea of adapting to what you see in front of you. And if you think about the great players, they do that exceptionally well, almost naturally. This situation, I know exactly what I need to do. And then, of course, in those high challenge environments where it's like do or die, you get those juices flowing in the positive way rather than the negative way. So, it's an interesting thing, the two things coming together there, but it's not about how good your cover drive is, and it's not about, how good your defensive game is. It's nothing to do with that. And I suppose that's why we started Mindflick in ways we realized there's this extra dimension to performance, which is around what's going on between your two ears, but also the environment, the dynamic environment that you're in, which is never the same. The context is always changing. So I do agree with that, very much so. It is interesting. We all are shaped by our early experiences. You came to the UK, obviously learned how to sort of assimilate into the UK environment. You talked a little bit about the opportunity you had, or the opportunities your parents afforded you to apply to an independent school, and how important you felt that was for you.
In terms of turning points, I mean, my parents' sacrifices, I mean, I think about them, if not daily, certainly weekly, were extraordinary. And, now as a parent of three, amazing 20-year-olds, I often think, would I have made those sacrifices? I mean, my parents literally decided that it was all about education. If my mother hadn't have had the conversation with my state school primary headmaster about applying to an independent school and pushed me to apply, knowing full well that we couldn't afford to go there had I passed, that sort of dream big, have ambition, education at all costs, the sacrifice. My parents didn't go out to a restaurant until I was 15 years old. And I still remember going to the Alpine restaurant in Watford and thinking, what's this? I mean, what's this thing about going out? And I didn't think they went on a holiday that was outside of the UK until I was 17. So they made extraordinary sacrifices. That obviously impacts you. At the time, I don't think you're particularly grateful, actually. And I sort of sometimes regret not being more grateful. Another one I often think about is I was okay at sport at school, but, I wasn't, I was never the first pick. And I remember when the school went on a cricket and rugby tour to Hong Kong, in my head at least, I was the last pick to go on that tour. And the impact that had on my subsequent sort of sixth form at school was massive. I went on the tour, I embraced it, got some award at the end of the tour, and suddenly you don't feel as much of an outsider. Suddenly you're in the school. And so I think back to this notion of turning points. It's not just recognizing, because you can't always recognize when they occur, but when you do get these opportunities, seize them. And that's another thing Katie and I have tried to instill in the kids, which is you get opportunities, embrace the moment, embrace the opportunity that you're given, and see where it takes you.
We were talking about this before we came in, actually, that, in the moment, that desire to kind of like that motivation to grab it and that kind of go-getter type mentality. But often it's based on what you've done before that determines whether you do have the capability, or if you even sense this is a moment to grab. Like, how do you prepare, or how did you prepare for those moments so you were ready when the moment came?
You don't prepare. I mean, when you're 18 years old, 17 years old, and you get picked for a tour that you didn't think you were going to go on, or you get cast in a play that you didn't think you were going to get cast in. You don't know their turning points. I think, though, if your attitude to everything is to focus on the opportunity, to embrace the opportunity, and I think you can instill that into children. And my parents certainly instilled that into me. They saw us being in the UK as a privilege. They saw us being in the UK as an education. It always interested me how they made English the first language in the house, because they wanted us to assimilate. They wanted us to learn the English way. Education, the only time they were ever cross with me was when I didn't give things my best. So I think you can teach people to embrace the opportunity. I think if you embrace every opportunity, by definition, when those turning points occur, you perhaps seize them better than others.
And I suppose actually, and you might agree or not about this, I think coming from India, having parents that were very ambitious for you, but also, probably being embedded and instilled in you that there's a big world out there, and it's not just about a very narrow group of friends or extended family, etc., potentially makes you more open to where these opportunities and these turning points might come. And then it's obviously about seizing them. Does that resonate with you?
I think it does. I mean, there's a lot written, and I think there's a lot of research about, immigrant success in countries. Well, a lot of it stems from hunger and determination and drive, but a lot of it stems from the journey to get somewhere is a journey that often requires sacrifice. I mean, obviously, I'm not suggesting, my parents came across the channel on a boat, but, my mother and father made a huge sacrifice to bring us to the UK, which was to give up their daughter and let their daughter grow up with her grandparents. I can't even imagine what that must have taken. But I think once you've made that level of sacrifice, your attitude to everything is to embrace it, seize it, do the best that you can, and that was definitely the value set that I think my mother and father instilled in me, which is just, be the best that you can be. And the times they got cross were not necessarily when I got a B+ instead of an A-, but the times they got cross were when they felt that I wasn't giving it my all. And I think there is something about the immigrant mentality that often pervades that. And I'm sure you see that a bit in sport as well as, my much more narrow world.
You then went from, obviously, it came across that you were bright and intelligent. You somehow got into Oxford University.
Cambridge, actually.
Oh, Cambridge, sorry.
That was deliberate?
Cambridge University. My research let me down there. Obviously, while you were there, you had a very sort of big diversity of people, obviously all very intelligent in their own right. What was that experience like for you, and how did that shape your view of the world?
Yeah, look, I don't know what you thought of your university experience, but the thing, when you've grown up in a relatively narrow geographic environment, you actually haven't traveled that much. You've been to one school, you've got one set of sort of friends from northwest London. The thing about university is just the extraordinary diversity of people that you meet, the backgrounds they've come from. And, Cambridge at that time was, and I'm sure is still today, was an incredibly diverse population. And I just remember being fascinated by, meeting people from the north of England, meeting people from Singapore, and realizing quite quickly how average I was. And I'm not saying that, to be sort of falsely modest, but you suddenly are in this peer group of exceptionally able people in every aspect of life: music, sport, art, obviously academically. And you sort of do this reset. You thought you were top quartile at school, you thought you were top decile at sport at school, and you suddenly do this reset when you go to the Cambridge University cricket trials, and there's a bloke called Mike Atherton and Steve James in the opening batsman's net, and you're like, okay, so you do this reset. I think you then navigate towards your peer group. But I think one of the things, I don't know if I appreciated at the time, but another thing that I believe very strongly is, you are a product of the people you surround yourself with. I think another thing that I've been blessed with is extraordinary peer groups. So I think about my friends at school. Andy and Keith that I still see. I think about my friends at university and just those peer groups. You do start to, I think, realize the value of those peer groups. And again, that's something we've tried to instill in the kids, because you can't, back to your point, Pete, you can't really say, wait for your turning points, or here's when your turning points are going to be. But you can instill playbooks that mean that when those turning points happen, you're really, really well equipped to deal with them. And I think thinking really carefully about who your peer groups are is something that I think is very powerful, even today. University, I think, was probably where that started to dawn on me, just how amazing and how ambitious you should be about those peer groups. What I thought was excellent was actually average. It drove a resetting of targets as well.
There's a standards bit, isn't there, where you kind of say you reset kind of where you believe you are in this or that. But there's also another bit of, you alluded to it earlier, that recognizing difference, seeing people that come from different backgrounds or have different worldviews. And I've just been interested to know, so because some people, and particularly under pressure, that those points of difference can become friction. Whereas for other people, actually, those differences are the fuel. They're the things that drive us. Actually, that's what could make us, in a sports team or in a peer group, can lift us all up. If you like, how have you approached it to see those differences as something positive? Because we live in a world where sometimes that isn't the case.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Pete. And I think probably because I was so insecure about always being an outsider, I've always enjoyed sort of embracing learning from other sort of outsiders. I remember our college football team actually was a real cocktail of geographies. I went up to Cambridge with this massive chip on my shoulder that they were all going to be like Straussy, public school boys from Radley,
Very handsome,
very
talented,
kind of very entitled, born with a silver spoon, and with a very good cover drive. And I that's what I went up there thinking. And then you suddenly in the college football team, and I remember our superstar was a chap called Rob Devey. He was from Bradford. We had a centre forward called Nicky Dry from Barnsley, and I didn't even know what Barnsley was. But I love that. It was also shaped actually by another period of my life that was, when I look back on it, I just think kind of was crazy, was to get to university. I got an industrial, they were called industrial sponsorships or scholarships. So I had to work it was from a company called Metal Box. They pay you a living allowance while you're at university, but you had to go and work for them for a year. And so age 18, I got a letter through the post saying you're going to Worcester to work in a factory for 3 months in an accounts department. I literally didn't even know where Worcester was. And I spent 3 months in Worcester, and I've bored the kids senseless with these stories already, but 3 months in Worcester in an accounts department, 3 months in a marketing department in Worcester. And then I went to a place called Carlisle that I'd literally never heard of for 4 months as an 18-year-old, as an Asian kid with no work experience. So I think that year off and having to fit in, football was the way I fitted into the factory in Worcester. Cricket was the way I fitted into the factory in Carlisle. But having to fit into those environments meant that by the time I got to university, I knew the power of diversity. I knew the power of learning from people who'd worked in a factory all their lives or worked in an accounts department. You can learn from everyone you interact with. It's not just, the people that get invited on podcasts.
I really like that frame of an outsider mindset, where it's not a negative thing. It's that I want to learn. Help me understand. Help me kind of immerse myself in this.
You'll know better than me, Pete, but there is something about human psychology where we are attracted to people that look like us. Joking aside, there are certain schools where a lot of the kids go to certain universities. Again, back to what can you control versus what do you have to sort of respond to. One of the things I think you can control as a parent, one of the things I think you can control, as a 20-year-old is going and seeking diversity. If you've been to a fantastic independent school in West London, do you really want to go to university and live with 4 mates from school? Or do you want to take the opportunity to live with some people from completely different parts of the country, completely different experience sets to you? And my hypothesis is the people that look for that will do better in the long run than the people that gravitate towards people that sound like them, speak like them, look like them. There is a path you can choose.
Comfort zone,
A comfort zone that's very, very samey.
It's already mapped out.
And I think, that's probably going to prepare you less well for the world than the people who get an opportunity to go and work overseas and take it. And there are so many conventions out there. Like when I graduated, it was all about getting into strategy consulting or investment banking. And now I get probably 6 emails a week from parents saying, can little Felix or Johnny or Hugo come and do some work experience because he wants to go into private equity or VC. And actually, I think back to your 20s and I just think, actually, do you learn more from following those conventional career choices and career decisions and, quote, manufacturing those turning points, or do you just learn more by putting yourself in the most uncomfortable, most ambiguous, least familiar zones that you can possibly put yourself into? Harry, our 28-year-old, I remember in his year off, sort of saying that he sort of wanted to do something charitable or something really different. And he went off to the northeast of India for 6 or 7 weeks and lived in a part of the world that he knew nothing about. I think when he's looking back in 15, 20 years of sort of life-shaping turning points, I suspect he'll be looking at his year off much in the same way that I look back on my year off and feel really grateful for working in an accounts department in Worcester in a factory.
That rich learning that comes from going somewhere outside your comfort zone. Yeah.
I think so.
And I think, that thing of learning to be comfortable being uncomfortable is such a powerful thing. And it also is very linked to fulfillment, isn't it? Because the things you feel very satisfied about in life, the things you achieve, they're the difficult things where you do feel uncomfortable.
I think that's right.
I agree. Like I have the exact same thought about my kids. Is there is this conveyor belt in front of them. There's a very easy path that they can follow. But when things do get uncomfortable for them, they've got to be resilient enough to be able to deal with that. And that's not preparing you for it. So I totally agree and back up with what you say. One other question I wanted to ask about your time at Cambridge, because you talked about, I suppose, expectations that, people have high expectations of themselves. And if you look at so many of the people that have really gone on and achieved great things in this country, a lot of them have come from Oxbridge one way or another. And so that speaks to culture to me. You talked about standards, didn't you, Pete? How much emphasis do you place on culture in the businesses that you work with, even the work you do with Rajasthan Royals? Like, does culture, is that the sort of the centerpiece of everything and everything comes off culture? Or is that an overused word that maybe people attach too much importance to?
Of course, culture is sort of a function of leadership. It's a function of the values that, whether it's the team or the institution or the business sets, and it's a function of the non-negotiables that are sort of defined in that group. And look, I think culture is hugely important. One of the things I learned from you about probably 8 years ago was after you just done a review, probably for the ECB or something, about the reasons for success. And, you studied various sports and looked into elite teams. And you said to me, extraordinary alignment is the big thing. And I think a combination of culture, having the right cultural values, and then all being aligned around those, I think that you don't go too far wrong if you've got those in your business or you've got those in your team.
Yeah, and I think the other point in that, and this just relates sort of the comparison with elite sport and an institution like Oxford and Cambridge, is if you're surrounded by great people who have high expectations of themselves and the other people around them, it becomes self-perpetuating, doesn't it? And I think the really best sporting environments seem to be able to get that. The others have little moments where they peak and everyone's aligned, and then it drops back down again. You have this sort of seesaw or roller coaster. But the key is to have that is so deeply embedded in your organization that it's just a non-negotiable. People don't even think about acting in a way that isn't absolutely high quality every time they turn up. And that's not as simple as you think it is.
Of course it is. And you sort of said a couple of things in there that are interesting, which are use the phrase seesaw. I mean, the reality is, again, as you get older, you realize there's going to be ups and downs. There's going to be wins and losses. Having a fantastic culture and having fantastic alignment, again, that's not enough, because even with that, you're going to make the wrong decisions. You're going to pursue the wrong course. Whether it's in sport, you're going to just get beaten by a better team. So you need that other critical component that I think is so valuable in life, which is the ability to then course correct, which for me is all about feedback. And if you've got, as part of your culture, rigorous, honest feedback is baked in. And back to turning points, the strategy consulting firm I went to work for was a company called Monitor. And we were sort of famed because our founder was one of our founders was a chap called Michael Porter, who wrote arguably the three of the most significant business books ever written: Competitive Strategy, Competitive Advantage, and Competitive Advantage of Nations. And the company was known and won a lot of its business because of its association with Mike Porter. We actually had another Harvard Business School professor who I think was just as important in shaping the culture of the firm. This guy called Chris Argyris, who you may have heard of, Pete, but very, very famous organizational behavioral sort of practitioner. Wrote lots of great pieces, but if people were to read one article, he wrote a fantastic article that got published in the FT called Teaching Smart People How to Learn. But at its center was this very simple observation, which is the smarter you are, or the better you are, and I turn this back to you, Strauss, and ask the question if this is true in sport, but the smarter you are, the less able you are to deal with feedback, and the less you invite feedback. And it was a simple insight. And Mark Fuller and Joe Fuller, who were the co-founders of our firm, decided that Monitor was attracting the smartest and the brightest people, but the firm would only achieve its potential if this culture of feedback was baked into everything we did. Now, as a 22-year-old, 23-year-old, coming out of the best institutions, I mean, we only recruited from 12 schools globally. So you've got the smartest of the smart, the brightest of the bright, the most ambitious of the most ambitious. But that cultural decision to make feedback at the end of every project, at the end of every month, at the end of every year, an absolute non-negotiable in the company, I think was so profound. And, Charles and I, as we've built the various things we've built within Blenheim Chalcot, have tried to stay honest to that. And actually, funny enough, having a business partner who's not only the smartest guy on the planet, but someone who's also totally committed to honest, radical candor or feedback, has meant that, I've not only shared a business partnership with someone who's giving you feedback the entire time, I live in an office with someone who's giving you feedback the whole time, and vice versa. And so that feedback is not enough of a spotlight, I think, shone on how important that is. Back to your question around turning points. If you've got really close friends, if you've got really fantastic peer groups that you respect, that are high quality, and you've got the instinct to ask for feedback at those moments, that's a great playbook because people talk about resilience the whole time, don't they? I've had a pound for every time someone gets on a podcast and says, well, the most important thing you need is resilience for young people. That's why I say to young people, it's like most young people look at me and go, well, what the hell is resilience? But what you really want to be teaching young people is the importance of peer groups, the importance of constant feedback. Those are actual things that when those moments happen, one of your seesaws that are down, if you've got a brilliant peer group, you've got great feedback, guess what? You'll have the confidence then to deal with most situations.
There's a lot in that, Manoj.
That's code for I went on a bit of a ramble.
No, it's not. But for instance, how do you take people who've been successful early, whose identity is often then linked to being successful or being intelligent or having the right answer, and how do they not see feedback as a risk to that? Because actually getting feedback that maybe you got that a bit wrong or you could have done this could feel like an identity level challenge. So how do you stay open after you've had success early and open to that course correcting kind of feedback? And then, as you say, how do you How do you surround yourself with those kind of people? And part of feedback is often disagreeing.
Totally.
I think often there's a modern ill, if you like, where if you disagree with someone, we should disconnect.
Yeah.
Is that kind of spirit? If you disagree politically, well, you shouldn't speak to that person. Or if we disagree on this issue, then I don't see how you can see the world from that perspective. And I think I've always thought that disagreeing well, which is part of feedback, is central, and we have to be able to do that without disconnecting from one another.
That's right, Pete, but that's easier said than done. And that's why my point about peer groups is so important, because it's also, or I think equally important to the feedback, which is, the truth is, the feedback we listen to most is the feedback that comes from the people we respect the most. I meet plenty of people who are open to feedback, but they haven't invested in necessarily and built the quality of peer group where the feedback that they get is high quality or the right feedback. And so it's great having loads of friends, but if you're getting the wrong feedback, that's not actually that helpful.
We're confirming feedback because everyone's like you.
Yeah, and I was away this weekend with a very close friend of mine, and I was listening to him talking to two of his kids about the importance of really thinking about your friendship groups. And he was actually doing it I was actually observing, but he was doing it in a very powerful way where he was complimenting them on their friendship groups and encouraging them to really value those friendship groups, because the thing he knows that they don't know is at some point they're going to have a massive bump in the road, and those friendship groups are really, really important. And I'm sure it's happened to you, Straussy, right, in sport, or I'm sure it's happened to you, Pete, in business and sport, but you really only understand the value of those peer groups when the proverbial hits the fan. One of my children was asking me on Thursday night about, in a business context, do you recommend going into partnership with someone? Actually, my response was, depends who the partner is. Just because you've seen Charles and I operate for 30 years in a reasonably successful way with all manner of ups and downs and seesaws, etc., you've grown up with that as a model for how you build businesses. Actually, very, 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 very hard to find a business partner or a life partner or any partner that you can be sure you're going to be successful with, and be successful with over a sustained period of time through lots of ups and downs.
Just a follow-up question on this, which I'm wary of saying because I haven't fully formed my own thinking on this, but the role that ego plays in all of this.
Yeah.
So I always feel in sport there's a dichotomy between, you need a certain amount of ego, you need to be able to back yourself under pressure to see the situation, make smart decisions, and commit to those decisions. And there's a degree of sort of self-reliance about that. But then also that openness to feedback, other people having different viewpoints and whatever. And ego, I think, to one degree or another, will shape where you are on that continuum. So if you've very high ego, you'd be like, I know all the answers. I'm the bee's knees. I'm just going to go and commit to what I know works for me. And that can be successful. And I just wonder if, when you look at yourself, and I don't know whether you'd be sort of honest and open enough to talk about the sort of where ego plays a part for you and other people you've worked with, but how do you view ego? Like in terms of when you're recruiting someone, when you're working with someone, the value or otherwise of ego?
And the correlations that I see is, I absolutely think you need ego, but you absolutely need ego with an openness to feedback, and one without the other is highly dangerous. So if I take the example of someone like Shane Warne, people would always say, oh, Warne's got, massive ego, he's instinctive, he's a showman. People had so many assumptions about Shane Warne. He was one of the most inquisitive, curious people. I had the fortune of spending, hours and hours with him. He would ask as many questions as anyone I ever met with. So I think ego is important. I'm not shy about the fact that I've got an ego, and I'm not shy about the fact that sometimes ego means you make the wrong decisions. but I like to think I'm open to feedback as well. And back to my recurrent theme of peer groups, keep investing in and keeping those people in your life and encouraging those people to constantly give you feedback. Even if you've got a bit of an ego, it keeps you in check.
And the danger is if it's sort of you drift towards hubris, especially if you've been successful, I suppose.
Also, the biggest danger, Straussy, and God, you know this, but the minute you think you're successful, you're done. Because the reality about success is, so much of it is down to luck and timing and things that are outside of your control. And the minute you start trying to comment on the secrets to success and even describe your company as successful or describe yourself as successful, you're sort of on that slippery slope, I think.
So just picking up that theme, you have built a very successful business in Blenheim Chalcot.
We've also built some incredibly unsuccessful businesses. No, but it's true, right? Blenheim Chalcot, we are a reasonably unique organisation. There's about another 30 that you've never heard of that have been anything but successful. You learn as much from that as you do. And I don't know if we would have had the successes without having the failures. I think that definition of success is kind of a really interesting question as well, which is back to people that have had an influence on, my life within my peer group. One of the things I love about my close friends is their definition of success is, yes, it's financial, but it's also family. It's also life balance. It's also being able to enjoy the fruits of that success a bit, whether it's golf or holidays or boys' weekends or whatever. I'm looking at our life here at BC right now. I've never actually felt more fearful, right? Because AI is changing everything about how we work, the pace at which we work, the opportunities available to our businesses, but the threats that are available to our businesses, the threat that AI poses to the society, to society at large. It's like right now, I'm not kind of walking into work feeling successful. I'm walking into work feeling like we are at possibly the most ambiguous, most uncertain point that we've been at for the last 29 years. But I'm relaxed about it and I'm not losing sleep on it, because if there's one set of traits and playbooks that we've developed over the last 30 years, it's the ability to deal with that ambiguity and the ability to deal with that change. And if you're not having conversations with your kids and with your younger colleagues about that, I think that's frightening. And just to go on one other mantra and one other rant, the biggest disservice we are doing right now in this country to young people is this work from home, because where you develop some of those learnings and some of those insights into how to solve problems, it's in the informal interactions that you have in an office. When I hear the stories about large institutions thinking it's okay to have 3 days a week or 2 days a week and okay to run your business on Teams calls, all I think is, what a disservice you are doing to young people. And you won't have had the environment where that pace of ambiguity and change is being solved and the problems are being solved in the right way.
And do you think that's the best way for some of those, those lessons of how you deal with uncertainty to be conveyed, like by being around people, by the role modeling, or are there key things that we could, say to our kids or instill in young employees that would help there?
I don't know what Strauss would say about the dressing room or a sporting environment, but I can't think of a complex problem that I've had to be a part of solving. I can't think of many that I've solved on my own. My ego might believe that's the case. I might have been the person that made the final decision, but don't confuse making the final decision with solving the problem. Right? And sometimes leaders do. I think you solve problems through discussions with the people that you trust the most around that particular domain.
Well, let me play devil's advocate for a moment there, because you talked about the rise of AI and how that's going to fundamentally transform our lives. There will be people out there that will say, well, going to an office every morning, having all these endless meetings where nothing really gets decided is wasting productivity. And actually, in the next stage, AI is going to be doing a lot of our thinking for us, in terms of getting the body of evidence for any decision, etc., and helping us to form that decision. Maybe the role that humans play in the next stage is going to be very different to the one that you talk about now, which is these informal conversations and whatever. I mean, what do you say to that? Because I'm absolutely with you on this. AI is going to change everything, but we've got to be thinking, what's our business and work environment going to look like in 5 or 10 years' time rather than what's relevant today?
It's two different things there, Strassi. AI is going to change the way that we work. My view is actually it's going to make meetings way more productive. It's going to make the alignment about what happened in the meeting much clearer when you get the one-page transcription within 2 minutes of the meeting finished. It's going to make the objective documentation of what actions were agreed much quicker. It's going to reduce a layer of interpretation, ambiguity, and slowness that comes out of meetings, which is why people then get frustrated with having meetings. But that's all about AI changing the way we work. The other side of it is, I hear this thing all the time about, well, AI is going to make kind of human interaction irrelevant. Human interaction has never been more important because it's through human interaction that you learn these other things, that you get the feedback on yourself, that you learn how to critically think, that you solve even more complicated problems because the easy problems are getting solved more quickly, such that we can think, where does that edge come from in this new world? And that stuff all happens in groups, and that absolutely happens face to face, and it absolutely happens in those accidental moments. I mean, there's a guy called Andy Haldane that did a lot of research into innovation. Why is it that Silicon Valley creates the innovation that it does? Why do you get these pockets of innovation in certain industries around the world? And where you get to is innovation occurs when you have accidental collisions, not planned collisions, not planned interactions. Let's the three of us get in a room and figure out how Mindflick becomes innovative. It's going to be the 4 minutes conversation we had before this podcast about the two different directions you could take this podcast. That's an accidental collision. That's an innovative conversation. That might lead to the growth of this podcast. It might lead to the growth of your business. And that's how you get growth, because you're not going to have accidental collisions on a Teams call. You're not going to have accidental collisions on a Zoom call. You have accidental collisions when you fly somewhere together, or when you walk out of it, you're in the back of a taxi after a meeting and you have a conversation giving each other feedback about how the meeting went.
Hi there. Hope you're enjoying the episode. We know people power performance. When you unlock their potential, everything changes. That's why we built Mindflick, a SaaS solution where performance psychology meets innovative technology. Trusted by the best in sport and business, Mindflick transforms self-awareness into high-impact performance. We give you the tools to move from insight to action, creating results you can measure. If you're ready to elevate your leaders, empower your teams, and fuel your organization's growth, find out more at mindflick.co.uk and start your journey today. Now, back to the episode.
I want to go back to Rajasthan Royals. We haven't talked about it very much up till now. You had this opportunity that came out of nowhere to bid for an IPL franchise in, when was that, 2007 or whatever it was. Take us through that whole journey very briefly around how someone who is building tech ventures got involved with what has been the standout success in terms of cricketing growth around the world, but also the journey that you've been on in terms of understanding the intricacies of high performance sport, elite sport versus building businesses, the similarities and perhaps the differences as well.
There's a lot in there, Strauss, and I definitely still don't. I'm still on that journey of understanding high performance sport, so I'll come back to that. Just a couple of things though, that will be interesting, I think, to the 5 or 6 listeners out there, is...
Did you just sledge us there? I think that was a sledge.
It's horrible because it's accurate.
Yeah.
Firstly, the journey to get into the IPL, right? I mean, of course, there's a lot of luck involved, but, the story is that actually I was convinced that the short form game, that cricket needed disruption to get growth. So the link with the UK and cricket at that time was cricket was as a sport in decline. It doesn't feel like that right now, but this is back in 2005, 2006. Counties were bankrupt. No one was watching. Everyone was turning off. So I was interested in a sport I loved. I was good friends with two of the England cricket captains of that era, Athers and Nass. And so through them, I saw the amateurism of the way the game was evolving then. And so I was interested in innovation, interested in we had 2 or 3 ideas. One was the best 11 cricketers didn't necessarily always seem to get picked for the Indian cricket team at the time. And Pop Idol was a massive thing. So we said, let's create a reality television show that would show that there was way more talent in India than necessarily got the opportunity. We thought we could run a cricket club better than the people at the time. So we found one, Leicestershire County Cricket Club, that would let us run the commercial side of the club. And we also thought that there was an opportunity to create a Champions League of T20. So we created a new tournament. All of those things were spectacularly unsuccessful in terms of wealth creation, return on investment, return on effort, return on time. But of course, what they did was create lots and lots of accidental collisions and lots of credibility for being open to ideas and open. So any innovative thoughts that were happening in cricket at the time would sort of find their way to us. One of those was the creation of this tournament called the Indian Premier League, which was due to launch in 2009. So when the IPL came along, Charles had been very patient with our early dabbles into cricket. And, when we sort of sat down and looked at the IPL and why it could work and how it might work, it seemed to check an awful lot of the boxes. But that's how we got there. So if you don't put yourself into the flow, if you don't put yourself into the conversation, if you don't put yourself into the environment, when the opportunities arise, you're not even going to see the opportunities. And look, the IPL was not. It didn't feel to me like a massively difficult decision at the time, because had it not worked, you would have invested not an enormous amount of money, but a couple of years of time, and it was a reversible decision. Back to the Bezos, reversible, irreversible. But there were just too many reasons why it should at least be moderately successful. And I think we knew it would sort of work, but again, we had no idea it was going to get so big so quickly. And we definitely didn't know that we were going to be at the center of that first year story. And, the Rajasthan Royals were the story of the first year, and we've been dining out on it for 18 years because we haven't won another trophy, as I like to remind the team. But again, luck, timing, accidental collisions, understanding a domain, having some credibility in that domain. I don't think it was pure luck that we got the opportunity, but when we got that bit of luck, we knew how to seize it. Then that journey, the second part of your question, which is the journey of understanding high performance sport, as Charles and I would often look at the Royals, while we've had different ownership percentages in the franchise, we've always sort of been in control of it. I look at some of our early assumptions. I look at how we managed the franchise, essentially applying the Blenheim Chalcot playbook to the franchise. I was incredibly naive. We had no understanding of high performance sport. We had great understanding of how to build a business, but high performance sport, we had some understanding of the things to look for with high performance, but high performance sport, we had no understanding. And it was a real journey. And as I look back over the 18 years, we've employed different models. The first couple of years, it was an outsourcing model. It was kind of Warnie's way or the highway. And then we evolved under Rahul to trying to build sort of more replicable structures and processes. As you know, I've always been fascinated by the application of data and analytics to sport. And there have been times when we've got that right and it's served us well. And there's been times when we've applied too much of it. But I think the world of high performance, everything is still undergoing huge evolution. And I get really excited by how AI is going to is going to push the frontiers of possibility out even further. There's so many frontiers in high performance sport, having now studied the US and pretty much all the sports as you have done, and as you've participated in. There's some huge areas where we're just in the foothills. One of my favorite is what you two obsess about, which is the applicability of analytics around mindset, and how do you take two batsmen with exactly the same statistics and figure out which one's going to be great in the IPL and which isn't? And so much of that isn't about analysing ball trajectories or shot trajectories, all the stuff that we analyse inside out. It's about how do you analyse the brain and how do you predict which individuals are going to problem solve at that crucial moment in the 19th over. Because what makes the IPL so special is 75-80% of the games get to the last over. How do you problem solve in that last over? How do you deal with pressure in that life? If I could predict that, and if I had a team of people who could really help me understand that, I'd believe we really did have some magic, but we're nowhere near any of that in high performance sport on the basis of what I've seen so far.
It's interesting. I always think that kind of, there's a pendulum sometimes that swings in high performance sport. We'll go towards data's the answer for everything, and then data gets over empowered, and we start losing some of that intuition, some of the kind of distinctly human kind of qualities. And then rather than say we need to balance that up, the pendulum swings the other way, and almost leadership teams say, right, well, we've tried that, we need to try the opposite. And this, we see in the Premier League all the time, the pendulum swings about every 18 months between different approaches to tackling the same problem. You mentioned like almost holding both of those at the same time, the human and the data.
Yeah, I suppose my challenge back to you there, Pete, is that pendulum swinging from data to instinct? Or is it a pendulum that swings from data that we can measure today to data we can measure tomorrow? So we've just been through a process of a very rigorous and lengthy process of choosing our next captain for the Royals, which is, as both of you know, a hugely important decision for a franchise. And we've tried to make it data-driven. We've tried to make it rigorous. We've had multiple rounds of interviews with 5 or 6 candidates, and we've tried to create a really detailed captaincy framework around what attributes we're looking for. And this sort of data versus instinct thing has come up because a couple of the candidates have sort of said, look, I believe in data, but ultimately I want to make the decision and it's instinct-based. That candidate may have grown up under a captain who operated under particular instinct. People say to me, MS Dhoni was one of the most instinctive captains to have ever played the game. I don't buy that. He wasn't instinctive. He just had an extraordinary database that was his, that was a competitive advantage because he played so many games and he could assimilate that data in such a unusual way, and he could deal with pressure in an incredible way at those key moments, such that as he's processing the data in his head, he's thinking clearly. So it's data versus and because we can't measure that data, because we can't analyze MS Dhoni's head, we don't see what preparation he might actually do when he's in his room up until half an hour before the game. We sort of just label him instinctive as opposed to data-driven. Shane Warne was always described as the most instinctive cricket captain and the most instinctive cricket brain. I had the benefit of actually watching Warney prepare for a game. He was anything but instinctive. I mean, he'd be on flip charts in a boardroom at our hotel in India with Jeremy Snape and Darren Berry, mapping out field positions for Virender Sehwag on a flip chart, not necessarily based on videos because we didn't have the analysts with the videos then, but based on having watched him play. Is that instinctive, or is that a combination of good preparation, having an unusually large database in your head, and having the humility to analyze that data, and perhaps the ego and the confidence to think clearly under pressure such that you can analyze that data? So I think this data and instinct thing I sort of often question.
Yeah, and I think there's an extra bit to this because I think when you started the Rajasthan Royals, your sort of evidence-based decision-making was a massive competitive advantage for you. All these other franchises were effectively going on gut feel, kind of experience, making a lot of mistakes that other sports had made over decades. You came in with a sort of Moneyball approach, and you had immediate success, mainly on picking players, right? Picking the right players to go on the park. Over time, that competitive advantage is reduced because everyone else has got data and analytics and all that sort of stuff. But there is definitely something there around walking onto that pitch as a group of players, feeling confident, feeling like we are either better, we got better players than the other team, we're better prepared, we've got a way of playing that disrupts their thinking. It's the connection between a point of difference, but also the psychology of it, which is knowing we're better. Because we know under pressure, under real pressure, when push comes to shove, the psychology of how you're feeling individually or collectively makes a huge difference. So I'm just interested to know kind of how you approach the psychology bit of this, because this is obviously our business. You look at it from a very different set of eyes. You know, the role that psychology plays, the role that form plays, the role that the sort of intangible within a team environment. How do you view all of that?
I think it's hugely important. And by the way, hugely interesting. And I'm not just saying it because you two clowns are here, but but it is. I just think it's the next frontier. I think it's the next frontier of business performance, next frontier of sports performance, which is trying to make those intangibles tangible. That's all I think about. And so whether it's a decision about your director of cricket, whether it's a decision about your head coach, whether it's a decision about letting a captain go, if you believe the tangibles matter, and if you believe that the intangibles over time can be measured such that they become tangible, and if you believe that data by and large drives better decisions, and if you believe in probabilities and giving yourself the best possible probability of winning, and I believe all of those things, then all you're ever trying to do, but yet you also believe in the things that you described. And for an hour and a half, I've tried to avoid that phrase that I hate, which is softer skills or softer character traits, because they are not softer, and they are true. It is true that your captain choice will have a bearing on whether you win or not because you've got more data or less data, depending on if I pick that captain or that captain, but because the captain has to make the players believe in the decisions that they've made. The captains have to drive the values and the behaviour, and you're absolutely right. I mean, Shane Warne, the data that gave us, quote, a massive competitive advantage in the early few years of the IPL wasn't data that led to us picking squads that would win the IPL. No, our focus was getting to profitability. So we picked the cheapest squads, but what we focused on was getting the best value for money. We would never have won the IPL without Shane Warne as captain, because Shane Warne took a group of players who, without any disrespect to any of them, it was not the best team in the IPL in 2008. But Warne had this ability to make you feel someone who was 4 foot, make them feel 5 foot. But I still believe, and I still think we can start to understand why he could do that. I think we can understand what are the attributes of the great captains, the great managers. Football's another sport I love, and this sport you both love. And there's so much narrative that gets created around certain managers. But I'm always interested in, well, why? Well, why was Jurgen Klopp why did he have such an extraordinary impact on Liverpool? And, you know, if that's the organizational structure you're going to go for as a football club, and if that's the value set that you want to aspire to, well, what is it we can learn from those intangibles to make them tangible?
It's interesting as you describe it there. I think because this is kind of our business really, to try and make some of those intangibles a bit more tangible so that we can actually have a discussion about them. And I think it links to something you said a moment ago, where we fall into sloppy language quite a lot when it comes to psychology and mindset and all those things. I think the word instinct is misused, because really it was intuition.
Yes.
Which is the sum of all of your experiences,
Yes.
not put into words yet. Instinct is evolution, and it's generally a bit dumb.
Yeah.
And I think that's the important thing that you're right. But as soon as we call it instinct, it's like it's this magical thing. Intuition is just everything I've experienced, that database that I built. That's something worth exploring.
And you know what I think? I think there's a massive correlation between the people who quote have the best intuition, and the people who practice the hardest, who work the hardest, who put more hours into that database. It's why I'm such a broken record on work ethic, right? If if your kids grow up with a really strong work ethic, give me 10 people with an amazing work ethic, and we will achieve better things than 7 or 8 people of higher academic level, of greater seniority, but with zero work ethic. And I choose the former every time. And I think structure gets really important, because the only thing you're certain of in life is that you are going to be unsuccessful at some point. And if your structure is built around the most instinctive captain, the most instinctive coach, the most instinctive chief executive, the most instinctive chief product officer, but where's the structure? Does that structure, if you take that person out of the structure, does the success continue? Does the success sustain? And that's where I think we're at a really interesting stage in high performance sport, where we haven't really decided and agreed on what's the optimal structure for a football club or for a cricket club in a privately owned world. Once you commit to a structure, then actually making the odd mistake on the individual, and sometimes you have to be ruthless about that, doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to sustain levels of success. And I sort of see that in football quite a lot.
Yeah, I think the other interesting thing in all of this is around, it's backing up your point around execution, right? So elite sport is a very noisy environment. You get blown off track very quickly because you have a couple of high profile losses, or one of your best players gets injured, all those sort of intangibles that you can't control. And do you have the staying power to just keep executing what you think is the right thing to do? We saw that with England in the Ashes. It felt like their game plan that they'd sort of prepared for 3.5 years went out the window after 2 test matches, based on a lot of noise that they were hearing from the media and others. And that's challenging. That's a really hard thing to do, to kind of have that North Star, have that methodology, execute it religiously, but also be open to being adaptable. And the dynamics have shifted, and we have to maybe, point that North Star slightly differently. That is the really hard challenge for elite sport in my mind.
And business, by the way. And back to what can you do versus what can you not do, right? And the things that you can't do is you can't control the outcomes. You can't control whether customers are going to take up a product, or whether they're going to buy more of something that you think they should buy, or you can't control the results. What you can do is say, have we got the structures? Have we got the processes that mean when these inevitable setbacks happen, we will have the right cadences, the right feedback loops, the right assessments that will help us course correct? And too often I see in sport and in business too much discussion about, the mega hire that's going to change your fortune, and not enough discussion about the quote boring stuff about, have you got the right cadences? Have you got the right processes? Have you got the right structures? Have you got the right feedback forms? Have you got the right interview templates? Are we constantly asking the right questions? Do we do the same debrief after a match when we win versus when we lose? Are we looking at the same data before playing Team A versus playing Team B? Those are things you can control. One of the things that Charles has driven into across BC is, obsession with cadences, because you can control cadences. Now, that if your management teams are having a 15-minute check-in every morning on what are the things that are blocking progress versus not, you don't know if the discussion's right. You don't know if the discussion's going to be right, but at least that discussion's taking place.
It's actually the sort of conversation we're having at the moment about our business, but also it backs up what David Brailsford said when we were doing this high performance review into English cricket. And he said, everyone talks about what we did with British cycling as marginal gains. And he said it was nothing to do with marginal gains. It was just about executing on what we said we were going to do. And that's the thing we did better than anyone else. And again, unfortunately with elite sport, you get these narratives and everyone jumps on them, and that's the way forward. But it is just doing the simple stuff really well and still be inquisitive as to how we can do things better, in my mind.
I think that's spot on, Strauss. I also think it's remembering that when you do have the highs, and look, the highs are great, and there's nothing better than winning in business or winning in sport. It's just reminding yourself that you probably weren't quite as good as you thought you were. And there was probably a bit of luck. And there were probably a couple of things that went your way. And also remembering that when things go wrong, you're probably not as bad as you think. We just had our worst season in the Rajasthan Royals in 18 years last year. Now, do I think we got everything wrong? Not at all. Not at all. It was the same structure, the same processes that we've been involving for, certainly the last 7 or 8 years. And, there were 4 games that we lost on the last ball. So when you're in a situation like that in June, what do? Do you resign? Do you give up? Do you change the entire squad? Or do you trust the process? And the process that you've seen over the last 6 or 7 years is a rigorous review process, a lot of feedback, a lot of questioning as to the why, and then you make a few changes and then you either recommit to the process or you don't. And, in our case, we've recommitted to the process and we'll see how we go this year.
Conscious of time, we've aired pretty much everything there, I think. And the question we ask everyone at the end of the podcast, if there's one thing about the journey that you've been on, your life experiences that you would want to share with our listeners, if you wanted to distill it all into one piece of advice, what would that be?
You are a product of the people that you spend most time with. So choose your close relationships carefully. Value, invest, and nurture those relationships, which I haven't always done, by the way. This is do as I say, not as I do. And constantly ask yourself if you're surrounding yourself with the best people you possibly can. Because if you are, you'll probably do okay. And if you're lazy about that, you probably won't do as well as you could have.
Manoj, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.